Lecture 20, England in the Age of Alfred.
Welcome back. In our last lecture, we examined the final collapse of the Carolingian Empire as new ruling dynasties supplanted the Carolingians, both in West Francia, where the Capetians constitute the new ruling dynasty, and in East Francia, where the Ottonians replace the Carolingians. Today we're going to leave the Carolingian Empire and its wreckage aside for a bit, and we're going to return to the history of Anglo-Saxon England. And we do so because in Anglo-Saxon England, Viking attacks had somewhat different consequences, somewhat more drastic consequences than was the case on the European continent. Anglo-Saxon England consisted in the 7th and 8th centuries of various kingdoms whose size and number were constantly changing. But some of the most important and most long-lasting were, for example, Kent in the far southeast, or Sussex, where the South Saxons had settled, Mercia, Northumbria as well. Prior to the Viking attacks on the British Isles, there were two trends distinctly visible in the history of Anglo-Saxon England. One trend was cultural, and the other trend was political. Culturally, the main trend was the rise of the Kingdom of Northumbria to a place of predominance within Anglo-Saxon England. It was Northumbria, located far in the north of Anglo-Saxon England, that produced the two leading intellectuals of the late 7th and 8th centuries, the venerable Bede, Abbot of Jarrow, and then Alcuin of York. It's also Northumbria that produces some of the most famous artistic masterpieces of the early Middle Ages, such as the famous Lindisfarne Gospels, which are written in 698 and illustrated so magnificently. Politically, the main trend from the 7th century to the beginning of the Viking raids is the ascendancy not of Northumbria, but of a different kingdom, Mercia, which began to gain control over the other Anglo-Saxon kingdoms and unite them under its rule. The kingdom of Mercia was most successful in establishing its control over the kingdoms to its south and to its east, and this control could take various forms. The kings of Mercia might demand tribute from other Anglo-Saxon kings. They would demand the right to travel through these other kingdoms at will without seeking official permission. But not all of the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms were willing to accept the control of Mercia. Northumbria, for example, manages to remain more or less independent. The most famous king of Mercia is someone by the name of Offa, who ruled from 757 to 796. Offa was a contemporary of Charlemagne's, and something of Offa's power and his ability to mobilize resources in Anglo-Saxon England can be seen even today in one of his most remarkable legacies, Offa's Dyke. Offa's Dyke was a giant earthen barrier that Offa had constructed between Anglo-Saxon England and Celtic Wales. It's almost like the Great Wall of China, only it's made out of earth. It probably was intended to prevent the Celts of Wales from crossing over into Anglo-Saxon territory and attacking it. And while its effectiveness was probably not very great, it would have taken a large number of people to actually man Offa's Dyke. Nonetheless, the size and the scope of this construction project are impressive. And they're impressive not just to us. They're impressive to Offa's contemporaries. Offa is one of the few Anglo-Saxon kings who we know to have had close ties with rulers on the continent, and Offa frequently corresponded with Charlemagne. Charlemagne referred to Offa in his letters as his dearest brother, which in the diplomatic parlance of the 8th century is a phrase you use of someone who is your equal. Byzantine emperors, for example, hated it when Charlemagne would address a letter to them saying, dearest brother, and they would always reply, my dear son, to show that, no, you are not our equal by any means. Viking raids on Anglo-Saxon England and the British Isles more generally began in the late 780s, and they came as quite a shock to the inhabitants of the British Isles. The British Isles had been free of outside attack for several centuries, and the Vikings were well known to the peoples of the British Isles because of their involvement in the commercial life of the North Sea. Compared to what happened on the continent, the Viking attacks on the British Isles escalated relatively quickly. Following the sack of the monastery at Lindisfarne in 793, the monastery at Jarrow, Bede's old monastery, is sacked in 794. Iona is sacked in 795. And whereas on the continent it took several decades for the Vikings to acquire the ability to attack anywhere they wanted by using rivers, in the British Isles, virtually the whole of Anglo-Saxon England and of Scotland and of Ireland are easily accessible to the Vikings from the beginning because they're relatively small territories and they are islands. Although the south and the east of Anglo-Saxon England are the most vulnerable because they face Scandinavia directly, it was no challenge at all for the Vikings to row around the northern tip of Scotland and to attack Britain from the west or to attack Ireland. Between 835 and about 865, Viking raids became an annual occurrence in the British Isles as well as on the continent. The Carolingian Empire experienced substantial Viking settlement only in one region, the region of Normandy. Anglo-Saxon England, however, was going to experience Viking settlement on a much larger scale. And on the European continent, the Vikings never went on to become the kings of anything. They succeed in becoming the counts and later the dukes of Normandy. But even that title is achieved only with Carolingian permission. The situation, again, is different in Anglo-Saxon England, where the Vikings succeed not just in settling in large numbers in a large chunk of territory, they also succeed in destroying several Anglo-Saxon kingdoms. In 865, a large army of Danes arrived on the eastern shore of Anglo-Saxon England looking to establish themselves permanently rather than simply to raid. And they capture the town of York in 867 and succeed in killing the king of Northumbria, and they make one of their own their new king. And they begin to knock off Anglo-Saxon kingdoms in rapid succession. East Anglia has its king killed by the Danes in 869, and the Danes take over that kingdom as well. And early in the 870s, the Danes even capture the kingdom of Mercia itself, which had seemed well on its way to gaining control over the whole of Anglo-Saxon England. It looked as though the Danes were going to succeed in overrunning the whole of Anglo-Saxon England in the matter of just a few more years. The Viking conquest of Anglo-Saxon England, however, is averted by King Alfred of Wessex, who ruled from 871 to 899. He is known as Alfred the Great, but then again, most people in the early Middle Ages were known as the Great. It's a rather debased title. Constantine the Great, Gregory the Great, and Charlemagne is Charles the Great, or Carolus Magnus. Still, Alfred the Great has some claim to truly having been great. In 870, even before they had succeeded in capturing Mercia, the Danes attacked the kingdom of Wessex, and the defense of Wessex was led by a king by the name of Ethelred and Ethelred's brother, Alfred. Ethelred and Alfred succeeded in defeating the Danes in 870, and when Ethelred died in 871, Alfred took over responsibility for the defense of Wessex and becomes the new king of Wessex. The Danes were persistent, and by 878, they seem to have gotten the upper hand over Alfred. The story goes that Alfred and his army were driven into a swamp in the middle of a winter where they had to hide from the Danes, and it seems likely that Alfred was indeed on the run in one sense or another. But in 878, Alfred managed to defeat the Danes rather severely, and so severely indeed that the Danish king who was fighting against him agreed to accept baptism as a Christian. As a result, by 878, the Danish advance in Anglo-Saxon England had been stopped, and Anglo-Saxon England was now divided into two distinct zones. One zone which was focused on the north and the east of England, was known as the Danelaw. And the Danelaw is the territory under the rulership of Danish kings and a territory that is experiencing substantial Danish settlement in the 860s and 870s and for several decades beyond. The other half consists of the Kingdom of Wessex and other Anglo-Saxon territories that are now willing to accept the overlordship of Wessex, since King Alfred seems to be the only one capable of defeating the Vikings. Indeed, today, if you go to England, you can hear for yourself some of the consequences of the Danish settlement in the north and the east. Many of the distinct attributes of the English dialect as spoken in the north of England should be traced back to Scandinavian influences. And if you visit an English village that ends in B, B-Y, or in Thorpe, T-H-O-R-P, those are Scandinavian terms and denote a place where Scandinavians settled during the 9th century. Alfred had to prepare Wessex for the possibility, even though that possibility never came into existence, that the Danes would attempt to conquer the whole of Anglo-Saxon England. And one of the actions he took was to fortify what towns existed within the Kingdom of Wessex, and he establishes a series of fortified towns or burhs, often on the site of old Roman towns at places such as Oxford and Winchester. Alfred was also known not just for constructing these fortified towns, but for his intellectual pursuits, which were indeed remarkable for the 9th century. Charlemagne had earlier attempted to promote intellectual reform, and Alfred does the same. He gathers scholars to serve in his court, but Alfred's own intellectual accomplishments far outstripped those of Charlemagne, who fumbled about trying to spell his name at night. We know that Alfred knew Latin, and he knew it very well. He knew it so well, in fact, that he translates 3 or perhaps 4 books out of Latin into Old English, including Boethius's Consolation of Philosophy. It was going to be many hundreds of years, not until the time of Henry VIII, as a matter of fact, that another English king would be literate and be able to author books in this way. After Alfred's death, the main task facing the kings of Wessex is to reconquer the Danelaw and to gain control of the Anglo-Saxon territory that had been lost. This task was not easy, however, because many Danes had come to settle in the north and east of England, and the task was made even more complicated because the Danes and the Anglo-Saxons are not the only parties that will be involved in the warfare. While the Danes focused much of their activity on England, the Norwegians had focused much of their activity on Ireland and had settled in sections of Ireland such as Dublin. The Norwegians had a tendency to attack either the Danes or the Anglo-Saxons in turn during the wars of reconquest as Anglo-Saxons attempted to take back the Danelaw. And the Anglo-Saxons still had to worry about Celtic Wales and Celtic Scotland as well, because the Celts would become involved in these wars, attacking the Danes sometimes, but attacking the Anglo-Saxons. As a result, the reconquest of the Danelaw was going to take a fair amount of time, but Anglo-Saxon rulers in the end succeeded in reconquering the Danelaw, and by 959 they had driven out Danish rulers and made themselves the masters of the whole of England. The Danish attacks on England, therefore, had a quite paradoxical consequence. They result not in the fragmentation of Anglo-Saxon England, which had been plenty fragmented at the time when the raids began. Unlike what happened on the continent, Anglo-Saxon England actually emerges more unified politically than it had been before. One kingdom, the Kingdom of Wessex, is now in control of the whole of Anglo-Saxon England. However, Anglo-Saxon England was not out of the woods yet. On the European continent, when Viking raids trickled out in the 920s and the 930s, they never resumed again. As in a bad horror movie, though, the Vikings came back to Anglo-Saxon England long after you thought they might have given up on their attempts to take over Anglo-Saxon England, and they are more formidable than ever. Viking raids against Anglo-Saxon England resume at the end of the 10th century. These raids are worse than before because now the Vikings are only attacking Anglo-Saxon England rather than Anglo-Saxon England and the continent. All of their energy is focused on Anglo-Saxon England. And these attacks are more formidable because by the time Viking raids resumed, a king of Denmark by the name of Harald Bluetooth had gained control of both Denmark and Norway. And he had created a relatively disciplined single army in contrast to the freebooters of the first wave of Viking attacks. The new Viking attacks begin in the early 980s. They start out initially as small probing raids, but quickly escalate into much larger attacks against the Anglo-Saxons. And in 991, the Anglo-Saxon king by the name of Ethelred has to pay tribute, or the Danegeld once again, to the Vikings, as it happened in the Carolingian Empire in the 9th century. This set a precedent that the Vikings were eager to continue, and Ethelred finds himself having to pay tribute money to the Vikings again after major raids in 994, and in 997, and in 1002. The large numbers of English pennies that have been found in Scandinavia dating from this period sort of attest to the great wealth gained by the Vikings as a result of these payments. Ethelred, confronted with a new Viking threat, adopted a few policies that were innovative in their own way that he hoped would enable him to turn this threat back. One policy was to ally himself with the Dukes of Normandy. Normandy, the one part of the Carolingian Empire where Vikings had settled in large numbers, had sometimes allowed the Vikings of Norway and Denmark to use Normandy as a base from which to attack Anglo-Saxon England. And Ethelred wanted to rob the Vikings of this base. And so he proposed an alliance with the Dukes of Normandy, whereby the Dukes of Normandy and Anglo-Saxon kings of England would aid one another against their enemies. And the Duke of Normandy agreed to this in 991. And to cement this agreement, Ethelred married the daughter of the Duke of Normandy. This marriage between the Anglo-Saxon king of England and the daughter of the Duke of Normandy was going to have enormous consequences for Anglo-Saxon England, consequences that are entirely unforeseen in 991. In addition to allying with the Dukes of Normandy and arranging a marital tie between the Dukes of Normandy and the Anglo-Saxon royal dynasty, Ethelred decided to try to massacre all the Danes of England. There were still many ethnic Danes in the Danelaw who were speaking Danish and whose loyalty Ethelred doubted. He feared that they were going to side with the Vikings rather than with the Anglo-Saxons and might turn on him. And so in 1002, Ethelred ordered a massacre of all Danes living in Anglo-Saxon England. It was impossible to carry this out completely. In many places, the Danes were so numerous and the English were so few that they could not kill all of the Danes. But a number of massacres were carried out in places such as Oxford. The massacre of the Danish inhabitants of England was a desperate act, and it backfired badly on him, because it angered those Danes who survived the massacres, and it very much angered the inhabitants of Denmark and Norway as well, who did not like to see their ethnic cousins being slaughtered. In 1003, the king of Denmark himself, named Sweyn, led a punitive expedition against the Anglo-Saxons to punish them for this attempted massacre. And the loyalty of the Danish inhabitants of England, in fact, went over to Sweyn and the other Danes. When in 1013 Sweyn landed in the Danelaw with yet another Viking army, the inhabitants of the Danelaw switched sides. They abandoned the Anglo-Saxon king of England, and they accept Sweyn as their king. With their support, Sweyn captures London in 1013, and Ethelred has to abandon England, fleeing to Normandy. All of his subsequent attempts to recapture England failed. The upshot of all this is the following. The second wave of Viking attacks had a consequence that was quite different from the first wave of Viking attacks. The first wave of Viking attacks had resulted in the unification of England under a single Anglo-Saxon dynasty, the House of Wessex. The second wave of Viking attacks drove that dynasty out of England and made Anglo-Saxon England into part of a Scandinavian empire. The kings of Denmark and of Norway were now also ruling over England. When Sweyn died, his kingdom is split up between his two sons. One, by the name of Canute, gets just England. But as of 1019, Canute was the ruler of England and of his father's other possessions as well. If England had remained part of this Scandinavian empire and had retained its North Sea focus, its subsequent history might have, almost certainly would have, turned out very differently from what eventually happened. The Scandinavian Empire, though, was short-lived. It fell apart in the 1030s and early 1040s, and as a result, in 1042, the dynasty of Wessex was able to return from Normandy quite peacefully, just stroll back into England and resume its position as the rulers of Anglo-Saxon England. Compared to other barbarian kingdoms, the Anglo-Saxons had a great run. The Ostrogoths never got out of the 6th century, and neither did the Vandals. They were both conquered by the Byzantines. The Visigoths made it into the early 8th century, but then they're conquered by the Arabs. The Franks, no one conquers the Franks. They're still there. The Anglo-Saxons made it into the 11th century, but then their kingdom, too, was conquered once and for all. In 1066, the last Anglo-Saxon king of England died, and a free-for-all broke out among various people who claimed that they should be the new king of England. The inhabitants of England wanted one of their own to be the new king. They didn't relish the idea of a foreigner coming and assuming the throne, and so they elected an Anglo-Saxon by the name of Harold to be the next king. However, there were two other claimants to the throne, two individuals who in fact had good claims to be the next king of England because of their blood ties to the dynasty of Wessex. One of those who claimed to be the true king of England was the king of Norway, an individual by the name of Harald Hardrada. The other person who claimed to be the next king of England was the Duke of Normandy, named William the Bastard. The only way to decide who was the legitimate claimant was to fight it out. And so Anglo-Saxon England prepared to be invaded both by Norway and by the Normans of Normandy. William the Bastard and Harald Hardrada raced to get to England first. Each wanted to be the first there, hoping that they could defeat the Anglo-Saxons and then defend against the other invasion. It just so happened, though, that winds blowing from north to south prevented William the Bastard from getting to England as early as he would have wished, and instead Harald Hardrada got there first. The Norwegians and the Anglo-Saxons fought, and the Anglo-Saxons won. But it was a very costly victory in which the Anglo-Saxons suffered severe casualties. And as a result, by the time that William the Bastard arrived in Anglo-Saxon England, the Anglo-Saxon army was already in a very weakened state and not in great shape to withstand this latest assault. At the famous Battle of Hastings in 1066, which the Anglo-Saxons came close to winning, Harold, the Anglo-Saxon claimant to the throne, was shot in the eye with an arrow, and seeing their leader fall, the Anglo-Saxons routed, and as a result, William the Bastard succeeded in making good on his claim to be the next king of England. The victory in 1066 of the Normans over the Anglo-Saxons at the Battle of Hastings represents the opening move in the Norman conquest of England. And thanks to the Norman conquest of England, William the Bastard got to trade in his name for the much more congenial William the Conqueror. The Norman conquest of England in 1066 and the end of the Anglo-Saxon kingdom of England is going to have many important consequences. The Normans were descendants of the Scandinavians, and at the time that the Scandinavians had settled Normandy, they were pagans. By the time of the Norman conquest, however, the Normans had long been Christian, and they had dropped their Scandinavian language and instead adopted French as their language. As a result of the conquest of England by this group of Frenchified ex-Vikings, England is wrenched out of the North Sea orbit and the Scandinavian orbit in which it had previously moved. In all of our lectures about Anglo-Saxon England, we've been referring to Saxony and to Denmark and to Norway. Those are the areas that mattered to England. Now, however, England is suddenly going to be oriented not so much towards Scandinavia and towards the North Sea as towards the English Channel and towards France. And as a result, England is going to find itself deeply embroiled in continental, especially French affairs, and not nearly as affected by developments in Scandinavia henceforth. The Norman conquest is going to be very important for England because as a result of this conquest, a French-speaking aristocracy becomes the new ruling class in England. And for centuries, England is going to be almost a colonial society with a large indigenous population of English speakers ruled over by French speakers. And indeed, the consequences of the Norman conquest can be heard in almost every lecture that I have given thus far, because the presence of this French-speaking aristocracy, which will continue to speak French for centuries to come, is going to have important consequences for the development of the English language. One of the most curious aspects of the English language is the fact that we have many synonyms, an unusual number of synonyms compared to other languages. We often have 4, 5, or 6 words that all mean the same thing. One of the reasons for that is that English is very influenced by French, and that often the French word for an object would then be taken over into English and would result in English having multiple words for the same item. In the short term, the main linguistic consequence of the Norman conquest of England is that Old English is going to die out. The language of the Anglo-Saxons is going to disappear as a flood of French words and some Latin words come into Old English. It is instead going to become a new and different language, Middle English. And if you pick up a Middle English text today, you'll probably be able to fight your way through it. If you pick up an Old English text today, you won't be able to read a single word of it. And the reason for that is the Norman conquest, which introduces this strong disjunction in the history of the English language. To conclude, Viking attacks on the British Isles were, in some respects, rather different from Viking attacks against the Carolingian Empire and the European continent. They lasted longer. They continued into the late 10th and even the early 11th centuries, whereas on the continent, Viking attacks were done by the early 10th century. Viking attacks on the British Isles resulted in extensive Viking settlement of a large swath of territory. Much of the north and east of Anglo-Saxon England experiences large number of Danes coming to live there. The Anglo-Saxon kingdoms that confronted Vikings in the 9th and 10th centuries often succumbed to Viking attack, as the Vikings succeeded in destroying a number of Anglo-Saxon kingdoms. Nowhere on the European continent did Vikings succeed in making themselves the new rulers or the new kings. At most, they succeed in gaining control of the Duchy of Normandy. Paradoxically, however, the main consequence of the Viking attacks on England is the greater unification of England. Fragmented into various kingdoms before the Viking attacks, Anglo-Saxon England comes first under the control of a single Anglo-Saxon kingdom, the Kingdom of Wessex, and the dynasty that had ruled over Wessex. Ultimately, though, it comes under the single unified control of French ex-Vikings, the Dukes of Normandy. In our next lecture, we are going to turn to another area that was outside the Carolingian Empire, an area that's somewhat different from Anglo-Saxon England. We will examine Al-Andalus, Islamic Spain, and its early medieval history.